In the autumn of 1955, trains rolled quietly into stations across a divided and exhausted Germany. From the carriages stepped men who looked far older than their years, thin, hollow-eyed, moving stiffly as if each step still belonged to another winter. Some wore fragments of uniforms long out of date. Others carried small bundles, all they possessed after more than a decade in captivity. For many families waiting on the platforms, the faces were almost unrecognizable. Children stared at strangers who were supposed to be their fathers. Wives searched for traces of the young soldiers who had marched away in 1941. These were among the last German prisoners of war released from the Soviet Union, men who had survived a chain of events that began with one of the most brutal campaigns in modern history and culminated in catastrophe at the Battle of Stalingrad. Out of roughly 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered there in early 1943, only about 5,000 would eventually return home. Their ordeal did not end with the lowering of their weapons. In many ways, it was only beginning. To understand how such a fate became possible, we have to step back to the summer of 1941, when Nazi Germany launched its vast invasion of the Soviet Union under the codename Operation Barbarossa. More than 3 million Axis troops surged eastward in what was intended to be a lightning campaign. German planners believed the Soviet state would collapse within months. Early victories seemed to confirm that assumption. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were captured. Cities fell in rapid succession. But this was not simply another military campaign. The war in the East was ideological at its core. Nazi racial doctrine cast Slavic peoples as inferior and viewed the Soviet system as an existential enemy. From the outset, the invasion carried elements of annihilation. Soviet prisoners were often neglected, starved, or shot outright. Civilians suspected of aiding partisans faced collective punishment. Villages were burned. Reprisals were harsh and often indiscriminate. The scale of violence hardened attitudes on both sides. Soviet partisans disrupted supply lines stretching across immense distances. German forces responded with brutal anti-partisan operations. Hatred deepened. The conflict on the Eastern Front became a struggle in which restraint steadily eroded. Between 30 and 40 million people, soldiers and civilians, would ultimately die in this theater alone. As 1941 turned to winter, the German advance stalled before Moscow. Supply lines were overstretched. The vast geography of the Soviet Union swallowed men and machines. The winter of 1941–42 was bitterly cold, exposing weaknesses in German planning. Yet instead of consolidating or renewing the drive on Moscow, Adolf Hitler shifted his focus south in 1942. The new objective was the oil fields of the Caucasus. Securing fuel was seen as vital to sustaining the war. In this strategic shift, the city of Stalingrad, an industrial hub on the Volga River, became a focal point. Initially not the primary objective, it grew in symbolic and operational importance. Control of the city would sever Soviet transport routes and protect the German flank as forces advanced toward the Caucasus. But the name itself carried weight. Capturing a city bearing Stalin's name appealed to Hitler's sense of political theater. By late summer 1942, German forces approached the city. The Luftwaffe bombed it relentlessly, reducing much of it to rubble. Thousands of civilians died in the first days of bombardment. Yet the destruction created a battlefield unlike any other. The ruins transformed streets into killing grounds and buildings into fortresses. Inside the city, Soviet defenders were ordered to hold at any cost. Stalin issued Order Number 227, not one step back. Unauthorized retreat could mean execution. Blocking detachments were positioned to prevent withdrawal. The message was unmistakable. The Volga line had to hold. German units entered the shattered city expecting to break resistance quickly. Instead, they found themselves drawn into a form of combat that nullified many of their advantages. Tanks struggled to maneuver among debris. Air power risked striking friendly forces. Fighting devolved into brutal, close-quarters clashes. A building might change hands multiple times in a single day. Soviet troops used basements and sewer tunnels to move unseen. Snipers and small assault groups harassed German positions relentlessly. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat war. It was exhausting, chaotic, and deeply demoralizing. Casualties mounted on both sides. Yet even as German troops pushed toward the Volga and captured much of the city, their flanks were held by Axis allies. Romanian and Hungarian units stretched thin across the open steppe. Beyond the city's ruins, Soviet commanders were preparing something decisive. Under strict secrecy, they massed over 1 million troops north and south of Stalingrad. Tanks and artillery were brought forward at night. Deception measures masked the buildup. Then, in November 1942, the Red Army struck. The counteroffensive shattered the weaker Axis flanks. Soviet armored formations punched through and advanced rapidly. Within days, the encirclement was complete. German Sixth Army and supporting units, some 250,000 to 300,000 men, were trapped. Inside the pocket, General Friedrich Paulus requested permission to break out while fuel and cohesion remained. Hitler refused. The army was to hold its ground. An airlift would supply it, he insisted. On paper, the Sixth Army required around 700 tons of supplies daily. In practice, the Luftwaffe delivered only a fraction. Fuel, ammunition, and food dwindled. Winter tightened its grip. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. German troops, many still equipped for summer, improvised clothing from whatever they could find. Rations shrank to meager scraps. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Frostbite, dysentery, and typhus spread through overcrowded shelters. The wounded often lacked proper medical care. Ammunition was rationed with extreme caution. Outside the pocket, a relief attempt, Operation Winterstorm, advanced toward Stalingrad in December 1942. For a moment, hope flickered. The sound of distant artillery reached the trapped soldiers. Yet the relief force was halted by determined Soviet resistance. The encirclement tightened further. By January 1943, the situation was hopeless. Soviet forces split the pocket into smaller sections. Airstrips were lost. Supply drops fell blindly into snow, often captured by Soviet troops. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, an implicit reminder that no German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. The expectation was clear. But the following day, Paulus chose surrender. On January 31st and February 2nd, the remaining German forces laid down their arms. More than 90,000 exhausted survivors were taken captive. For many, surrender did not bring relief. The first ordeal was the march into captivity. Prisoners were forced to move long distances in freezing conditions. Those unable to keep pace risked being left behind. Food was scarce. Shelter minimal. Out of the tens of thousands who began the journey, a large proportion perished before reaching transit camps. Transport by rail offered little comfort. Prisoners were packed into unheated freight cars. Journeys could last days or weeks. Disease spread rapidly. Mortality remained high. Upon arrival in the Soviet interior, prisoners were sorted. Officers were separated. Specialists such as engineers and doctors were assigned according to their skills. The majority were organized into labor battalions. The Soviet Union had suffered enormous destruction. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure was shattered. Labor was desperately needed. German POWs were assigned to mines, construction projects, forestry, and industrial rebuilding. Conditions varied, but food shortages were common throughout the Soviet Union, affecting civilians as well as prisoners. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion claimed many lives. Medical supplies were limited. Makeshift remedies substituted for proper treatment. For the Stalingrad prisoners in particular, survival rates were grim. Of the approximately 91,000 captured, only a fraction endured the early months. The harsh combination of pre-existing wounds, malnutrition, and exposure proved devastating. When Germany surrendered unconditionally in May 1945, many assumed remaining prisoners would soon return home. Instead, captivity continued. The Soviet government viewed POW labor as part of reparations for the destruction inflicted during the invasion. Camps gradually released prisoners as projects were completed, but the process was slow. Families in Germany often had little information. Record-keeping was inconsistent. For years, relatives did not know whether husbands, fathers, or sons were alive. The uncertainty became a lingering wound in post-war society. The International Committee of the Red Cross pressed for clarity and repatriation. Some prisoners were released in the late 1940s. Others remained. Political tensions of the emerging Cold War complicated negotiations. Only after Stalin's death in 1953 did broader releases gain momentum. In 1955 and 1956, the final large groups were allowed to return. By then, more than a decade had passed since the guns fell silent. The men who stepped off those trains were survivors of both a catastrophic battle and years of captivity. They re-entered a Germany transformed, divided into East and West, rebuilding amid ruins, grappling with guilt and loss. Out of the immense number captured at Stalingrad, roughly 5,000 ultimately made it home. Their story is not only one of military defeat, but of endurance under extreme hardship. It reflects the broader tragedy of the Eastern Front, a theater defined by ideological hatred, immense sacrifice, and cycles of violence that consumed millions. The fate of the Stalingrad prisoners remains a stark reminder that in total war, suffering rarely ends when the shooting stops. For those who survived, the battle echoed long after the ruins of Stalingrad were cleared and rebuilt. Their return in the mid-1950s closed a chapter that had begun in the summer of 1941, when columns marched east with confidence, unaware of the winter and the captivity that awaited them.